really, when it comes down to it, whether you're working towards an industrial solution, a transportation solution, a healthcare solution, a lot of the same elements are really the same. You're trying to sense something, communicate, analyze that data, and act upon it. So the key really with that short clip was return on investment, and really the recommendation is to really start with, what is the end goal? So sometimes, even though we're all technologists, the technology can be the easiest part. It might be easy to grab a sensor and connect it, but really you have to think about what is the end goal. So from the standpoint of, are you trying to prevent a maintenance issue, prevent a truck roll, or create a new revenue stream? You really have to think of that from the beginning. So from the standpoint of challenges, really these are a kind of a list of challenges that are very key that we've seen. So from the standpoint of IoT being adopted, it seems like it's going a little slower than expected. And some of the key inhibitors really are security and privacy. After all, I sat through some of the presentations of some people earlier today, and you don't want your cool connected device to be that portal through which hacker attacks. Edge connectivity really continues to be a key challenge. For example, about 85% of devices that are already installed in brownfield applications, they are not connected. So basically, the data on those devices are hostage, I guess, if you want to call it. And while IT and OT converging is important, it's kind of like two worlds colliding, because one wants to sense and expose as much data as possible, and the other really wants to protect and secure, and you have to meet together to achieve the goals. And then even once the data is acquired or exposed from a piece of equipment, really sometimes it is still underutilized. So there's cases where you send the data to the cloud, it sits there, you can have years and years worth of data, but if you're not providing analytics or some intelligence on that, there's not going to be a whole lot of ROI that you're going to get from that solution. The obvious answer would be that in analytics is that key, but then that also comes with a challenge. So from the standpoint of where does that occur? So analytics could occur in the cloud via solutions like IBM PMQ and others. It could occur at the actual device on the wearable. Amber was talking about that earlier today. Or somewhere in between, an aggregation point, a gateway, mobile device. And yet another key challenge is interoperability and standards. So, I'm sure everyone here, you're passionate for IoT, so you probably have all sorts of gadgets like I do in my house. And, it's never good when you add that last gadget and it doesn't interoperate with, your other apps or your other devices. You don't want to be on vacation thinking you're turning off the light and you're opening your garage door by mistake. So what Intel really provides is we have created an IoT platform. Really, it's a blueprint of solutions so that we can help our partners, whether they're OEMs or system integrators, to be able to get to that IoT solution much quicker. And really, what we've seen, even though Intel, of course, has a lot of solutions, all the way from the thing to the cloud, it really isn't about one supplier providing a comprehensive solution, but really a reliance and a networking of the ecosystem. So Intel's IoT playbook is very similar to, I guess, with the PCs or server markets. So just like you don't go to Best Buy and get a Intel computer, you get a Dell or Lenovo. With IoT, it's very similar. So the Intel solutions really would be coming from partners like Kontron, Eurotech, Dell. And this application, this haystack model here, is a way of thinking about our platform. So on the left, it shows the spokes represent the very specific sensors and actuators that are required to complete a solution. And Intel doesn't make sensors, for example. So we are relying on our partners to provide that complete solution. However, if you move towards the right, what you can see is that Intel is really looking for that 70 or 80% of a solution that is consistent despite whatever the vertical is. So whether it's healthcare or a connected factory, what are those common elements that can be reused? And not to get into all the specifics, but the logos up there, of course, would represent our processors. Wind River is an acquired Intel company. They of course, have an operating system, also edge management solutions, McAfee for security, and we even do some open source solutions such as Trend Analytics Platform. So what I thought you might be interested in, since you're a local Minnesota group for the most part, is an example of some collaboration that we've done here with partners. So Honeywell, they of course are a well-known supplier for sensors, and then also as an OEM in the industrial safety market. They've been in that market for about 90 years.
I want to share a little bit about Intel's vision about the connected worker in collaboration with Honeywell. Specifically, we want to talk about the first responder use case. Just to give you an idea of what this end-to-end system looks like, we have edge devices paired with a gateway, which then feeds the cloud. Within the cloud, you can see a dashboard where the incident commander would be able to see all of the data.
Here you have our devices. You have our mobile hub, which aggregates the data from all the different devices. All the other devices, the wearable devices, are based on our Quark SE. You have your posture sensor, which tells you whether the fireman is standing, laying down, walking, running, crawling. The gas sensor, which tells you whether you've reached some dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. And then you have your gesture sensor, which allows you to send messages non-verbally.
Within the context of this first responder POC, we have our cloud solution based on Intel Trusted Analytic Platform, where the data from the mobile worker are ingested, analyzed, and then processed in real time and generate alerts.
How great would it be if you had a system that could detect your pressure, condition of your firefighters, their pulse, all of their activities without having to worry about it.
Chris, I think it would honestly be a godsend. You know, as an incident commander in a very controlled environment, if we had a hand in the monitoring of our interior crews, we could literally have a hand in their safety.
So moving back to the IoT platform, this is how that Honeywell example falls on the Intel IoT platform. And it's really actually a pretty good example, again, what Amber was talking about this morning, of having more and more analytics or intelligence at the edge. So while you could have sent all the accelerometer data streaming to the cloud, determine what the activity of the worker was, and if they were performing any particular gestures, it's possible, but in a safety situation, you don't want to have to rely on that. But also, by having that intelligence being provided right on the device by using a Quark microcontroller, in this case with pattern matching capabilities, it was looking for behaviors that it was trained in previously. And then once that occurs, instead of having to send all that data to the cloud, it can just send the response. The guy is laying down dead, or whatever it has determined. And I think, the common theme also is really IoT is nothing without the data, and therefore very important, sensing the data. So like I previously said, now Intel doesn't make humidity sensors or accelerometers, but we do have technology in sensing, for example, RealSense. This is a retail example where we partnered with a Swedish company called Volumental, and it was a pilot that was done at Nordstrom. So this 3D scanner company, they provided the means to have a person shopping for shoes be able to, have a very precise 3D model of their feet. So as you can see, one foot is 5-something and 1 foot is 6-something. So that would really help the customer experience to find that, perfect fit for the customer. But then on the flip side, and probably the retailer would say this is almost more important, it really helps the retailer to understand what are the customer base and what kind of products are successful for reaching the needs of that customer base. So before we move on to the panel section, while there are a lot of challenges that we covered, Intel is really strong at partnering up ecosystem partners. We work with ISVs, SIs, OEMs. That's really, what our platform is all about. And to, give you a kind of quick jump start, I encourage you to check out our solutions directory. And, of course, you're all probably familiar. We have various maker kits and things, this being the newest one, Curie, that you can get at Micro Center and places like that. And since this is IoT Alley, I was thinking it might be good to check out America's Greatest Makers. Has anyone watched it? It's been on TV for like the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's by the same producers as Shark Tank. So similar kind of scenario. You get up with your invention based on the Curie Maker Kit, and then the top prize is $1 million. So I think it would be really cool to have someone from Minnesota next year. So in transitioning to the panel, we're going to have a panel of 5 representing OEMs, suppliers, et cetera. And the moderator will be Phil Wilson. He's the general manager of BuzzFeed Minneapolis, focusing on software that distributes BuzzFeed content everywhere. And he runs Mobile Twin Cities and is the co-founder of Minovate.
Thank you very much. think I'm echoing. Good. We're going to go ahead and get some chairs out, and these chairs have name tags on them, panelists. So you have to sit on your chair so you match the slide.
That's good.
So I will introduce everybody, and we can get started. We have some really great folks assembled. As CTO at Exosite, he's an accomplished C-level technology leader who's experienced in strategic, operational, and financial management of cross-functional teams in highly competitive markets. From Exosite, here's Mark Benson. As executive residence at Momenta Partners, he's working with portfolio companies and other clients as a mentor, advisor, consultant, starting with smart sensors. As the CMO of Honeywell's sensing business, he has moved to looking at end-to-end solutions across the stack. Ashish Bhattacharya. You've, of course, already heard from the IoT Innovation Sales Executive and part of a global IoT innovation group at Intel Corporation. She is Peggy Emerson. And as the founder and CEO of Hydrate, she piloted the massively successful Kickstarter connected water bottle, born right here in Minnesota, Nadia and Wynn. And he's the founder of NimbleLink Corp and serves as an executive, chief executive officer with more than 20 years of operations experience. He previously served as vice president of operations and sales at Logic PD. He's Scott Schwalbe. We talked before as we prepared for this panel. There are so many things to talk about and to highlight in the ecosystem that is IoT. It's going to be difficult to really find the greatest starting point. So why don't we just sort of play off of Peggy's last slide, one of her slides, talking about privacy and security. So I will kind of start, Ashish, I'll start with you. There's the privacy challenge in changing and affecting your business, the customers. Tell me about how you work with your customers on addressing the security and privacy issues.
Sure, thanks a lot. Well, it's great to be here, great to meet all of you. When I think of privacy in the IoT space, the phrase that comes to mind is, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. So this is really a tale of two cities, because what happens is when you look at the personal space and your information, it's incredible what we are willing to give up, involuntarily or voluntarily, and there are different scales of that. But whenever you're downloading an app, would you like to share your location information? Well, it's a parking app, so if they don't know my location, can't do anything. So I'll do that. At the same time, when you look at enterprise installations, whether it's a building control, whether it's a process plant, an airport, anything like that, there is just no way that people want too much of information to be available. And therefore, this privacy really is going to play out in a very different way in different domains. Now, as you know, on a personal level as well, there are different degrees of which people are willing to share information. And so you see that. In the enterprise space, what I see as a trend is a number of startup companies are going to end installation customers, whether they are buildings or process plants, and they're saying, hey, isn't this data yours? Don't you own the data? Isn't there a contract? And of course, these contracts and the legal structures are still catching up with what's happening in IoT. And therefore, they say, well, if you have the data, these big companies X or Y are going to be pretty slow and bureaucratic. Why don't we just work with you and we'll kind of get you all the analytics and the dashboards visualization? So I do see that coming as a sort of disruptive trend, but it's still early. But in the main, I would say in the installed base of buildings, hospitals, airports, process plants, there's still a great deal of trepidation about privacy and where data goes and connectivity and things like that.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that, because privacy is very much a generational term. Privacy to one, say, the age of 50, as opposed to the privacy, the concept of privacy to somebody that's 20. There are more and more data breaches, more and more data being leaked about individuals. We hear about it fairly regularly. Mark, how does that impact business, and how does it impact the individual as far as how they care from young to old?
Yeah, it's really interesting. across the board, we're seeing, privacy issues as increasing. The awareness is really growing across the board. But the interesting thing to me is how that awareness is raising in the eyes of the manufacturers of the devices themselves, their own responsibility in protecting consumer data. And I think it's a good thing for all of us that awareness is being raised. But I think as evidenced by, some of the fights between Apple, the Department of Justice, that's been happening recently, is that we're seeing that consumer data privacy is turning into, in some ways, a brand statement, or things that millennials or older people can think, this is a company that stands behind data privacy for me. And so it's really interesting that is changing in some ways from not just risk reduction from the consequences of a breach, but that actually has brand consequences.
And I'll open this to Peggy as well, just to talk a little bit about what are the technology behind the protection of data and security. Can we address that a little bit? What kind of technology is being used?
Yeah, so from the standpoint of Intel, and getting back to the ecosystem thought again, so there's different things that we've developed that are pretty much open source. So EPID, Enhanced Policy ID, that's a technology that we donated to some consortiums and competitors even. Atmel has adopted that, and that gives a means to identify anonymously that devices are within a valid group, but not have to give up their unique ID. So, if some data came from this room, it would say it's from the IoT Fuse room and we trust it, but not that, Dan sent the data, something like that.
Let's kind of shift gears a little bit about that data. And again, Scott, tell us a little bit about how that data is being used. We talk about the amount of data that IoT devices can generate. How is that being used, and what are you seeing as far as how people are wrangling this huge amount of data and using it?
Sure, it's in its infancy in a lot of states. As we listen and we think about what data are we gathering and how are we going to use it. The other issue, back to privacy, if we get too far on the side of privacy, all of a sudden there's no data to actually use, and where's the ROI? If you can't actually gather the data and you can't actually use it, what's the sense? And so there's going to be this really interesting balance to be made of privacy versus an ROI within a company. But we're seeing, it depends on. Every vertical is a little bit different. So if you're in the enterprise area versus the consumer area, if you've got a device that's just sending out saying, "Hey, somebody's here," there's really not that much data that's being used in the IoT Internet of Things space. But if you're in a farm application where you're pulling every piece of data out of the CAN bus of the tractor to do precision agriculture, it really makes sense then to actually do a lot of analytics and to pull all this information and use it. So as we talk about the business and the ROI, the data really differs across each of the verticals and the end users. I don't know if you have any.
Mark, can you add to that? I've had the pleasure of working with Mark on a project that harvested a great deal amount of data from a golf equipment standpoint, golf maintenance equipment. Tell me a little bit how you're tailoring the data you're collecting and how you're serving that data.
Yeah, so big data has been around, the concept has been around for some time, but big data insights, it seems, are few and far between. And so I think there's this trend of collecting data and then realizing how to monetize that data. And a lot of times the use cases are fairly fuzzy, I think, around exactly what to do with that data down the road. And the manufacturers that I've seen that have been successful in this way have been the ones that have had a very clear focus on what they're trying to accomplish with the data. So in this use case, Phil, that you mentioned with the golf course example, there was some engine trend monitoring data, and it had an impact on the ROI for a golf course. And so the manufacturer in this case had a very clear view of what the customer needed in order to deliver value that would make a difference, and then tailored the data collection, processing, analytics strategy to be very pragmatic and focused on that core value, and that's why that was successful, and I think that's a pattern for success.
So if I could add something here, I think what happens with these things, with the Internet of Things, data analytics, is that senior business leaders don't quite get it yet. And what happens with that is that if they don't get it, and if the people who sign the checks don't get it, then why are we surprised that these things are taking longer than we think to get adopted? Data scientists are, a pretty rare breed, pretty expensive breed today. So that it's just getting a few people and putting them in doesn't solve your problem. It creates much more problems because in the organization, the culture of thinking about data, the culture of developing products, like when someone's developing a golf course piece of equipment with an engine, is the product designer, he or she, thinking about the streams of data and where data is going to go, which will be visible, which will not, APIs? I think that culture is still in the early stages of evolving. That's why we end up with situations like this.
Speaking of that, Nadia, I want to bring you into this because when you first conceived of Hydrate, was it the data that you were seeking that led you to that, or was it the actual hardware that you started with and then decided what data you wanted from that hardware?
Yeah, when the idea was conceived was actually the problem. So long story short, I got so dehydrated that I almost passed out on a bus ride home after a long day. So truthfully, we didn't start with the data. It did come up once so after we start working on Hydrate, we actually got accepted into Techstars mobile health. So just based on the program, it was actually heavily based, or like conversations around health data was it was brought up a lot. But what we realized about health data is that as a fitness tracker, or as we see ourselves, like a health and wellness company, there might or might not be real application for that data yet. So as you mentioned before, like people talk about that a lot, there's a lot of hype about it, but how are we gonna use this data? That's a different question. In our specific case, we actually have seen some changes happening just within this year. So the way we see that is there are a lot of insurance companies who usually, before this, they see, they use only like a few things as KPI for people's health. So in our case, it would be a person's BMI, but the switch has happened to people are looking, instead of looking at BMI, a lot of insurance companies are actually looking at behavioral data right now. And that's where companies like Hydrate, like Fitbit, and like that are tracking more behavioral health are gonna come in. But again, it's so nascent that it's something that we're not looking at yet. The way that we see that is we're gonna focus more on user adoption first, and then potentially the data.
Gotcha. Scott, I think you wanted to add something on the data piece as well.
No, that's good. We can move on.
All right, that's so fine. I don't want to cut you off. First, I want to see, are we getting to the topics that you guys are interested in? We obviously haven't gotten to all of them yet, but are we missing anything that you're saying, oh, make sure you cover this? Please let me know, because we want you to be satisfied with what you're getting out of this panel as the user. And speaking of the user, let's talk, you and I talked a little bit about the end experience for what IoT can offer the user. Can you touch on some highlights of that and what those that may be developing products in the IoT space should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think this one I have to be a little careful because my next session here is going to be talking about IoT from a customer value, customer experience perspective. And some of my friends in the audience know that once I get talking, it kind of runs away with me. So I've got to watch what I say here. But I think ultimately what you need to think about is if you look at any application that we're doing, and it's not limited to the IoT space, in my view, ultimately, customer value and the customer experience will determine long-term whether these applications really get accepted and whether they scale up. I mean, if you think about something like a Fitbit, Nadia was just talking about these things, our core behaviors are so difficult to change that I read a statistic that somewhere around 40 to 50% of all wearables get discarded in 6 months after they're purchased. Just think about that statistic, right? That to me is frightening, and that's a clear statement about how difficult we are to change behaviors. Now, when I'm in a work environment, you can mandate it and you can change behaviors because there's a sword hanging above your head. But in our personal lives, it's more difficult. So I would say that just starting with the customer in mind, just, some of the presenters earlier today talked about empathy, talked about the customer experience. What problem are you trying to solve? And really having a clear view on that. And I'll give you a very small example. So in my previous work at Honeywell, we made some toggle switches. It's just an on-off switch, and it goes into various high-performance applications. I mean, what can you do with a toggle? It's a switch. It goes on and it goes off. It goes into equipment. It's been around for 75 years, so let it go. So we found that we were in a concrete pump pouring application. So there are these big trucks that come in with the concrete and the pouring. And the guy who was controlling it had a kind of a keypad on his chest. And those have toggles to control the nozzle, and as you can imagine, it needs to be precise. What we found there was, first of all, he's wearing massive gloves. The weather was Minnesota weather, so of course it's wonderful, it never affects anybody. So that was one more factor, kind of, sweating or freezing, depending on what it was. And he couldn't take his eye off that pump nozzle. So he had to look there and control these 4 toggles. And what he was actually asking for was different response fields or a haptic feedback, something that buzzes, something that does something when it's moving left or right, to be different to help him. Now, if I had sat with a design engineer in an office and talked about toggle switch response characteristics for 6 months, I would have never gotten that piece of feedback from the customer. You stand on that construction site for 1 hour, and you get that feedback. So I think the point is just that living with your customer, walking a mile in their shoes, having that empathy is what leads to a great application and a great experience.
Who's the customer? So I think that's the biggest challenge of adoption when we create IoT solutions, of figuring out who is the customer. Who is really the customer for the Fitbit? Is it the actual person wearing the Fitbit, or is it the company that's gathering the data that wants to sell them more? As we think about creating solutions and we work on this, the biggest challenge we're seeing in the ROI for somebody comes up with an idea and they have, this is what we're going to sell, this is what they want, and ultimately that customer has no money. They have no reason to buy it. So you have to go up the chain and say, who is that customer? If it's on any of the applications. So I agree that you really have to go and really figure out if you're going to be selling sensing information, and if it's solving a problem, is there a bigger customer for the data, and ultimately where is that wins. But that's the biggest challenge right now, is to figure out, in a lot of these cases, when you're starting to bring hardware and the connectivity and the network and the cloud, you have multiple customers along the line, and which one do you serve?
Let's talk a little bit about connectivity. I mean, it's when we talk about IoT, it really lends itself to wireless. But that can mean cellular, it can mean Wi-Fi. What are you folks seeing as far as a trend on how to best connect devices in the IoT ecosystem?
So I'll just start. It's all cellular, just to let you guys know. No, seriously, it's really the again, IoT is so broad with multiple verticals and multiple customers, the connection. But you are correct, wireless. But I think earlier today you heard Bluetooth. You get into the consumer space. You're looking at the Z-Wave, Zigbee, Bluetooth. You get out remote and you're out in an oil well somewhere. You really don't have that many choices. But cellular and possibly satellite. But some of the trends, obviously, is IoT is starting to take, I think, Peggy, you said 80-some% of sensors are out there that aren't connected.
Right.
And they all want to be connected. So, but you've got to get the cost point down to be able to connect to those, a secure cost point. And there's technologies like LoRa technology. There's, a lot of people are hearing about Sigfox, people putting up their own networks. You're probably hearing about Cellular trying to do in narrowband IoT, trying to drive it to 10-year battery life. So there's a lot of technologies coming, and we're seeing trends to in all these spaces. But I can't say that there's one winner across the breadth, but you're definitely seeing trends within certain verticals.
And what Intel has seen is, well, we've been typically taking, the wireless solutions that have been for the consumer space and then adopting some for IoT. And I think what you'll be seeing is a little bit of a different approach just for IoT because it has its own challenges. We're seeing a lot of combination of wireless technologies required, like, a combination of cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth for sure is very common. But then in our gateway space, we're starting to get a lot of different wireless technologies, more specifically for vertical. So for industrial, we're seeing a lot of 802.15.4, for example. So in that case, it's not always a platform across everything. It does tend to be different for different applications.
Nadia, what's the form of connectivity for Hydrate?
For us, it's Bluetooth Low Energy.
Gotcha.
It's pretty standard for a lot of consumer electronics products.
And what led you to that was just simply because that is the sort of standard for that particular
Standard, and it's
vertical?
just easier for us to integrate with a lot of existing devices too, because obviously our product comes with an app. So it's the easiest one, it's the most standard, it's easiest to support.
Gotcha. Mark, are you seeing anything as far as your work at Exosite that is standing out?
Specifically with wireless technologies?
Yeah, and connectivity.
Yeah, I think just the only thing I'll really say about it is Bluetooth really I've seen as a standard, that's emergent and has all kinds of use cases, especially for configuring devices with a phone that don't have a user interface. That's one of the really interesting use cases for that. But also, just as Scott said, that as cellular costs are coming down, the plans, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to do cellular, that I think that we'll see that take off here in the future.
And I think what a number of the telecom providers, what they are also looking at is, how do they extract more value out of existing infrastructure, number one, because, cellular in some places with data plans, et cetera, you can increase revenue, but they see this as a new source of revenue. And then they are coming up with dedicated networks as well, which are evolving, but, there are early stage networks coming up, which are more dedicated for IoT data, machine data in a lot of places. And I think that will also continue building out. On standards, I think there is a broader standards question as well, which is that, traditionally when you look at, in the old days, they used to call it the walled garden, right? You can come into my garden, it's a beautiful garden, but it's a walled garden. Once you come in there, then you can't talk to anybody else outside. And I think that's going to be a very, very interesting challenge because there are so many standards coming up in terms of communication protocols, in terms of different things, all seen, open interconnect, all kinds of standards. But what you see is that many of these standards are thinly disguised but vendor-driven standards. And so there's a phrase I've heard saying, this is not your grandfather's standard. It's not an IEEE developed or an international effort developed, because those things take time. They will happen, but they are more deliberate, multi-country, multi-year efforts, and that'll happen. In the short term, there's much more of a land grab. I have a big ecosystem, you want to play with me? Well, come on, sign up, and then you can go ahead. And that's what we're going to see for a while. It's going to be this kind of the war of the standards, if you will.
Justin, how much time do we have, and when do we want to go to?
15 minutes until 1:45.
Until 1:45. I just want to make sure we have plenty of time. So how many in the room are actually working on an IoT product right now? Let's talk a little bit about developing an IoT product. Nadia, you had obviously a very successful Kickstarter campaign. What other forms of funding have you found are available? We'll open this up to everybody else, but as you build this business, what kind of response are you getting from people that want to fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, there are a lot of, for early stage IoT companies, there are a lot of accelerators that are available. That's actually the route that we took, because the way that we saw that is we didn't just want the funding. It's not just about the money. It's about the mentorship and about the experience that we can learn. As far as actual funding, so whether you're doing a seed stage, which is what we're at right now, the biggest challenges that we've run into is the fact, so yes, great, we have gotten an awesome Kickstarter. We have done quite a bit in pre-sales too after that. But the big question that I keep hearing over again is, have we shipped yet? because there are a lot of challenges that come with shipping the product. So that is what we keep hearing over and over again. So that's one thing about IoT, I guess, talking to IoT investors. The other thing that we also hear a lot about IoT investors too is where's the data play. I personally have, I think it really depends on which space you're in. Data play, it always sounds sexy. It's always like, we know a lot of startups that do that really well, but I think it's not for everybody. And I think it's just something to keep in mind about. Yeah, and when we were starting the company, we actually ran on really little in funding. We did prototyping. First of all, we did a lot of FDM prototyping, so you can actually find those for relatively cheap. We actually did a lot of our 3D printing for $15 a piece in the beginning, believe it or not. There are devices like Arduino. There's a local company called Punch Through Design. They actually provided us with the first Arduino boards with Bluetooth integrated with them for us to do it. So I think the bottom line here is it's not that expensive to get started, but it is pretty expensive to actually make it through carry it through. For us, we decided to hold off on equity fundraising for a year. So we took the 120K from Techstars last March, and we actually haven't taken anything since then. And there's a reason behind it. The reason behind it is, the thing about IoT businesses, it is really expensive, and we want to be able to validate that on the market first before we go and fundraise. So we decided to do a Kickstarter. We raised 600K from there. And then when we finished our Kickstarter, we realized that just because we know how to run a campaign on there doesn't mean that we actually know how to sell online. So we opened our online store, and then a year later, we actually have been running just on revenue alone. So that's the story. That's kind of how we broke the cycle. There's always that vicious cycle in hardware where you need the funding to make the product, but you kind of need to get the validation for the product to get the funding. So crowdfunding, pre-sales, that's the way that we broke that cycle.
Got it. You bring up an interesting point about, what are you looking for? Data, you're looking for users, that sort of a thing. Everybody that you read when they comment on the state of IoT is that it's still very much in its infancy, that we haven't really hit the big time yet. How does that impact, how is that particular perspective impacting the adoption and the interest by investors in the IoT space? And I'll throw that open to anybody. I don't know, Scott, if you want to weigh in on that.
So it really is dependent on which area, again, of IoT we're focused on. If we all talk about IoT is just in its infancy, but you talk to Honeywell, they've been doing IoT for 20, 30 years. It was just called something different. It was machine-to-machine communications, and you've got PLC. You got all this in the enterprise world and industrial, what they call industrial IoT now, which used to be called M2M, which used to be called SCADA, which used to be called, going back and forth. It's very mature, and there's a lot of evidence that you can bring to bear very quickly that you can, demonstrate. But when you start getting into the areas, the new areas of the connected home and areas where you're starting to break into new markets, what I'm seeing is it's really around the data. What are you doing with a recurring revenue plan? How are you capturing recurring revenue to capture data? It's similar. They're trying to measure it in a lot of cases like a SaaS company. So you're going as how many new users have you seen? So you're seeing some of that playing, which makes it difficult because IoT is not SaaS. It's a combination of hardware and middleware and software and solving business cases across the board.
Peggy, can you kind of highlight some of the hot verticals in IoT, and then how much of the technology and products that are being developed can kind of cross over those different verticals?
Okay. Well, things could change, as you probably saw from Wall Street Journal, a lot of changes at Intel these days. But so right now, the IoTG group is horizontal across all different business units within Intel, but within our IoT group, we're organized by verticals. So those would be transportation, industrial, both energy and then kind of more smart manufacturing, healthcare, and then we kind of have a group of incubation IoT verticals as well. And so from our standpoint, like I said in my slide earlier, we're trying to really be intentional about what can be reused across all those different areas. And then we really do even consider customers partners. I mean, we partner with a customer because they know that vertical. Like for example, when Ashish was at Honeywell, we worked on some projects together, and that was because no matter how broad Intel's technology could be, we wouldn't know the space that Honeywell's been working in for 50 years.
So I think if you look at a couple of things, one, I would say that having worked in a sensing business for 5 years at Honeywell, it would be simplistic to say that all the sensing problems have been solved. There are some pretty big sensing problems which people have no idea how to solve. I'll give you an example. These big current transformers that step down and bring power to our neighborhoods and homes, every day in the US, a couple of transformers blow up. And how long does it take to replace them? But typically 4 months, 3 months. Takes a long time because these are big, heavy pieces of equipment. And actually it's clear that in the transformer header, the top part of it, hydrogen gas builds up. And if there was some way to sense that, I could actually know pretty easily when that thing is going to blow up. The problem is we don't have a hydrogen sensor. What the name. So I can give you lots of examples. So I think that when you look across these stacks, while definitely there is a lot of things that we can do in the data, I think at every stage of the stack, there are some really interesting business problems that people are working on. And so I would really encourage people to think about that from your perspective as well, that, do I have the right tool at that level of the stack so that you're optimizing the overall system? And sometimes you can over-engineer. I mean, I can think of a sensor used in an aerospace application, which if you bring it to a home application, it's obviously over the top. So I would say that. Two, I would say the point that Peggy was making, this is a team sport. So what you're really seeing is that no company is going to be able to do everything on their own. And so partnerships, alliances, and being just agile at this stuff, being able to work effectively is going to be a major new skill that people are going to have to develop. And that's something that's going to be there. In terms of verticals, what we saw in some of the work that we had done was manufacturing is definitely a big space. So all the factories making factories more efficient. Transportation logistics is definitely another big space where just moving things from one place to another, making sure they get there at the right time. Buildings in general, that's another big space. So there are a variety of spaces, but I can tell you that 5 years from now, when we're sitting here in IoT Fuse's 7th conference at the time, we might be finding completely different verticals and use cases compared to what we're seeing now.
Sounds good. Justin, you need to sell them a sponsorship for 7. We have just a little time remaining, and I want to, I've asked a lot of questions. I want to open up questions to the floor. We have precious few mics, so I'm going to ask you to stand, yell out your question. Steve, I'll repeat it so it can be heard on the camera. I do what I can. Yes.
Yes, I'm Patrick Delaney. So I don't know but millennials, we have a lot of industrial IoT here, I think, today. Millennials are now the largest age group of the workforce. I don't know if people knew that. And a lot of millennials, like myself and like Nadia, we grew up just completely in the internet. That was our life.
And the question is?
So a question. How do we get more younger people, how do we get more people like Nadia here today? Maybe Nadia could help us. I mean, you did a really great job. Could you talk to that a little bit more? How do we get more people like you here?
So the question is, how do we involve more younger developers, business folks involved in the tech IoT space?
Yeah, I guess I can speak to the way that I personally got involved was through Startup Weekend. So hackathons is a great way to get young, because I mean, that's the thing about the people, I guess, a lot of people of my generation that I've seen is that if there's one thing that we are up to is a good challenge. So yeah, host more hackathons, and I know that you guys are doing a great job with that, but I'd definitely love to see more. Yeah.
Anything else, John?
Yeah, so I would add to that I think one of the biggest challenges that we're being faced across the board, actually regardless of age, is with IoT is finding the why of IoT and not just the how. And I think that especially people who have been rooted kind of in M2M or industrial IoT kind of for a long time, it kind of gets sort of stale, or you talk about a lot about the technology and wireless standards that are emerging and these things that they're not directly connected to the why of IoT or why you're making somebody's life better, why you're making the world a better place. And I know that's something, especially with millennials, that's something that's they're kind of value driven and want to do things because it matters, not just to kind of work for one company for 30 years, but do something that is actually going to make a difference in the world. So I think that's true to get more younger people, more millennials involved, but I also think that that's true for IoT in general, is really focusing on the why, otherwise the how really doesn't matter.
So I think here I might have a personal stake because I belong to a couple of millennials. They own me completely. And I think what you see is the sense of purpose that they were talking about. I think that's important. But there's a demographic thing that's coming at us as well. Except in this room, the rest of the world is getting older and older. And there is a projection from the Department of Defense that in the next few years, there's going to be a shortfall of about 500,000 technical people just in a couple of those domains. So we're really seeing a shortfall of millions of people in terms of engineering jobs, and anyone who's trying to recruit and retain engineers or technical people will tell you it's not easy. So I think there's definitely something to be said for being more conscious, Patrick, about involving more people in the domain.
Other questions? Way over there.
You guys started this morning, or maybe during the day, where people were saying that everybody is talking about IoT, but it's not taking off as fast as we sort of anticipated before we read. What do you guys think? I'm looking for just like one word or one short phrase. It's your biggest challenge to actually get this process to get built. Is it cost, is it size, is it usability, is it data? Anything, if you guys can come up with something.
So the question is, what thing can serve as the tipping point for IoT to take off?
I would say in a phrase, it's organizational transformation. When we look at IoT, the take-up of how fast that it's happening, investor interest is high, users seem to want cool new gadgets, there seems to be a lot of promise, but at the end of the day, in order for organizations to actually make it happen, they have to take real people working in real organizations with real processes and tools, and they have to change that into a new direction that is really rooted in how hard it is for people to change. Just like that, it is also hard for organizations to change. That's what I would say, just in a nutshell, is organizational behavior and change in particular. That is one of the biggest reasons why IoT has been taking longer than it has.
Yeah, and I also think in a way it's a combination of the last two questions. So the younger people, they come to their big companies in their first job, they're all excited, like, oh, I know IoT and I was in a hacker thing and, I can connect everything. So they're, in the basement during their lunch on a side science project. And, really, I encourage you, if that's your situation, is, go to the C-level, talk to, maybe on the side at lunch, talk to the VP of a business unit and say, hey, this is a problem, and if you connect it, you're going to save $2 million. I mean, you might have to fudge the numbers a little bit, but, that's where it has to start. It has to start from the top down, and an executive being like, I'm willing to put money into that, because unfortunately it's the chicken and the egg. You make it, and then if you don't really trust it and rely on the solution, you're not going to prove out the return on investment.
2 words: unrealistic expectations. Bottom line, when you created your product, you really had no idea how much cost it was going to take to bring it into manufacturing. We've got a Raspberry Pi, and I slap it together with a free Wi-Fi, and I throw it on Bug Labs for free, and I'm thinking, wow, I've got a product. I can, in a month, I can sell this for $5 and go out and charge $30 a month, and I've got a business. So it's education. We just need to really help the early stage, the startups, the folks that are doing it really understand what it takes. And then we also, on the other hand, who's making the decisions in the enterprise? IoT now all of a sudden brings to bear the hardware, the product management, the IT group, brings to bear all the different aspects of the company, and until they change organizationally to make those decisions, there's going to be these unrealistic expectations. And so it's a lot of training, education, and as we go through that, it's going to help us get, it's going to move, but it's just taking time and training.
I personally think it's more free beer, but we're going to start here.
All right, so probably maybe you have a question that the rest of you disagree with, but by what metric are we saying that it's slow? I don't see it as slow at all. It seems to me to be rocking. So
We don't have 50 billion connections. So again, that unrealistic expectation is,
we're not at 2020 yet.
exactly.
Seriously, I mean, I actually don't get it because, yeah, this 50 billion crap. I mean, whether it's a lot, right?
But to your point, the question is, why are we saying this? To your point, if in the natural world of just natural expectations of growth, it is growing, and it is growing that way. But the analysts, there's a whole world of people just building a bunch of hype around it and creating these unrealistic expectations of growth. That's just my opinion.
So, for example, for Intel, and I might not remember the exact number, right? I think we grew 22% in the last quarter for IoT. And while that met some base level expectation, the original goal was a lot higher, just from an Intel perspective.
I think we
It
should
is
probably-
true. GE made $6 billion in revenue last year in industrial IoT. M&A investor interest, M&A in IoT has never been higher, and this year is on the trajectory to be the highest ever. It is happening. I think it's been somewhat overhyped perhaps by analysts, and so when you look at some of those key markers, you say, well, gosh, it's not happening quite as fast as that. But it is happening, and it's happening fast.
We're already a little bit over. I'm going to take one more question, and yes, sir.
So most of what you guys have been talking about here in the last few minutes is you're trying to determine why the Internet of Things hasn't been adopted more quickly or it's not going as fast. I would put forth that it's basically the lack of clarity on the value of IoT, and from a company perspective or investor perspective, not understanding or not knowing what the value of IoT projects are, IoT products. So what would you suggest would be a path to educate executives, investors on the value of IoT?
Really, want to repeat? More free beer.
You want to repeat that?
What is the pathway to, I don't know, publicizing the value of IoT?
IoT Fuse.
Write that man a check.
We're starting to see some case studies emerge of companies and products that are successful, and I think that that's really where the truth lies. It's analyst hype or even just ideas of how to monetize IoT is one thing, but the proof is a whole different story, and that's where executives can start believing. At ExoSite, we've seen a number of companies put major deployments in production that have turned financial results. Those case studies are really golden for the rest of that organization, whether there's more products, more services, and then as those get publicized for other companies to be able to see that. But in a word, I think it's the case studies of where it has really happened.
All right. Peggy, Ashish, Scott, Mark, Nadia, thank you very much. Your ecosystem panel.